Master Sergeant Earl Tanner had processed 11,000 personnel files in 22 years behind the same Scardo counter, and he had never once watched a room laugh at a soldier before she'd said a single word. It started with a folder. Thin, gray government standard, the kind that should have held 3 or 4 years of evaluations, training certificates, the small paper trail, every soldier dragged behind them like a shadow. Sergeant First Class Wade Brennan flipped it open at the intake counter, flipped it again, then held it up so the line behind her could see. Page after page, Brennan said, grinning at the 16 new arrivals shuffling their gear into Fort Renwick's in-processing hall. Look at this. Nothing. No award citations. No deployment narrative. Half these pages just say redacted, like she stapled in her grocery list by mistake. He let the folder fall shut. This is what an empty record looks like, people. Remember it. Don't let it happen to you. A few of the new soldiers laughed, the nervous kind, the kind that comes from not knowing whether it's safe not to. One of them, a private barely out of basic with his duffel still cinched tight from the bus ride, glanced sideways at Halvorsen as if checking whether she was about to argue, the way you check a stove burner to see if it's really off. She wasn't. She stood with her gear at her feet and her eyes forward, and the private looked away first, embarrassed on her behalf in a way she clearly wasn't going to be on her own. Tanner didn't laugh. He'd seen plenty of thin files in his time. Soldiers who'd kept their heads down, soldiers who hadn't done much yet, soldiers who'd washed out of something and didn't want it discussed. But he'd never seen a thin file with a black classification bar running the length of 6 pages, each one stamped in the corner with a code he recognized from exactly one other folder in his career, a folder that had been pulled from his counter by a colonel with a security escort and never seen again. The soldier, standing at the front of the line, didn't flinch. She was younger than Tanner expected for someone with that much black ink in her file. Late 20s, maybe hair pulled back regulation tight, posture so level it looked machined. Her name, tape, read Halvorsen. She let Brennan finish his little performance, and, when he was done, she said only, addendum sealed under operational security, Sergeant. You'll need AG 2 pull to open it. I can't do that from this side of the counter. Convenient, Brennan said. It's procedure, she said, and that was all. No raised voice. No argument. She picked her gear back up and waited for the line to move, like she'd said this exact sentence to exact men like Brennan more times than she could count, and had stopped expecting it to matter. Tanner watched her face. There was nothing on it he could read, no anger, no embarrassment, nothing performing for the room. Just a kind of patience that looked, to a man who'd spent 2 decades reading what people's faces did when they lied or postured or panicked, like the patience of someone who already knew exactly how this morning was going to end and had simply decided not to rush it. Staff Sergeant Halvorsen. Brennan read off the cover sheet, loud enough to carry. Reporting in for the Mountain Recon Training Cadre. Cadre wants operators with a record. This, he tapped the folder against the counter, isn't a record. It's a hole where a record should be. I'd start thinking about a slot in supply if I were you. That landed harder than the joke had. A couple of soldiers in line stopped laughing. Tanner felt something tighten in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. The feeling of watching a man build a conclusion out of material he didn't understand, brick by brick, in front of an audience. Halvorsen said nothing to that either. She simply stepped to the side of the counter to let the line move, the way a person steps aside from weather. But Tanner caught the smallest thing. Her eyes flicked once toward the clock above the door, as though she were timing something, as though some part of her had already decided exactly how long she was willing to let this go before it stopped being a small embarrassment and started being a problem someone else would have to answer for. It was at that moment, with Brennan still smiling at his own joke, that the cadre door at the end of the hall opened and Lieutenant Colonel Owen Falk walked in. Falk ran the Mountain Recon Training Cadre, the way some men run a parish. He met every incoming class personally on intake morning, before the paperwork buried them in acronyms and before the cadre instructors got their hands on them and started grinding off whatever softness basic training had left behind. He'd done it for 6 cycles running. Tanner had never seen him miss one. Sergeant Brennan. Falk's voice wasn't loud, but it cut the room down to silence in a single pass. What am I walking into? Brennan straightened. Nothing, sir. Just walking the new arrivals through what a strong file looks like. And what one doesn't. Whose file? Brennan held it up, a little less sure now. Staff Sergeant Halvorson's, sir. Reporting for the cadre. Most of it's redacted. I was telling her she might want to consider. Give it here. Tanner had handed files across this counter to colonels for 2 decades, and he knew the difference between a man reaching for paperwork out of habit and a man reaching for it, because something in his spine had gone still. Falk's hand, when it took the folder from Brennan, didn't shake. But his eyes did something Tanner recognized from his own face in the mirror some mornings. The look of a man doing arithmetic very fast and not liking the answer. He opened to the first redacted page. Read the classification code in the corner. Closed the folder. Looked at Halvorsen for a long moment. The kind of look that wasn't asking a question so much as confirming one he'd already half answered himself. Your hollow mark, he said quietly. For the first time that morning, something moved behind Halvorsen's composure. Not surprise, not relief, just the smallest settling, like a held breath finally let down a notch. Yes, sir. Tanner didn't know the name. He watched Brennan's face instead, watched the smugness drain out of it the way water leaves a cracked glass, slowly, and then all at once. Sir, Brennan started. I don't. You don't, Falk agreed. Sergeant Tanner, pull the secure terminal. I'm authorizing AG to release on addendum echo, file designation hollow mark, effective now. My authority, my signature, my responsibility if anyone upstairs asks why. Tanner's hands moved before his head had fully caught up, 22 years of muscle memory carrying him to the terminal at the end of the counter while his mind was still circling the word hollow mark, trying to place it among the handful of legends that move through Army records the way ghost stories move through old units. Never quite confirmed, never quite denied. He typed in Falk's authorization code. The screen blinked, asked for biometric confirmation, took it, and went dark for 3 full seconds before the addendum loaded. Tanner read it once, silently, and then understood why the file had been thin. It hadn't been empty. It had been the opposite of empty. It had been so full of things that mattered that none of it could be allowed to sit in a general personnel folder where any clerk with intake duty could thumb through it on a slow Tuesday. Read it, Falk said. Not to Tanner. To the room. Tanner cleared his throat and read. Operation Ravenwood. Classified long-range reconnaissance and interdiction initiative, 3-year duration, for confirmed actions. Team lead, Staff Sergeant Ren Halvorsen, call sign Hollowmark, youngest soldier, male or female, to complete the Army's long-range reconnaissance qualification course on first attempt. He paused, because the next line made him look up at her involuntarily before he kept reading. Sole surviving team leader at the Greyfin Hollow firebase collapse. Both teammates wounded in the initial breach. Subject held the eastern perimeter alone for 5 hours and 40 minutes under direct and indirect fire, coordinating extraction for 11 wounded soldiers for the collapse position before accepting evacuation for her own injuries. Awarded Silver Star. File sealed under operational security per ongoing classification of Operation Ravenwood assets and methods. He kept reading because the page wasn't finished and neither, apparently, was she. Subsequent to Greyfin Hollow, designated lead instructor for Operation Ravenwood's continuity training, training 6 follow-on team leaders to her own standard prior to medical rotation stateside. Tanner looked up again. That line explained the empty months on the public side of her file better than anything Brennan had guessed at. She hadn't vanished into nothing. She'd spent them teaching other soldiers how to do what she'd done, quietly, off the page, because the page wasn't clear to know it happened. Nobody in the in-processing hall said anything for a moment that stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of silence, the kind that comes after a held note rather than before one. 5 hours and 40 minutes. One of the soldiers in line repeated, quietly like he was trying to number on for size and finding it didn't fit anywhere comfortable. 11 men, said another. Halvorsen hadn't moved. She stood exactly where she'd been standing when Brennan had tapped her folder against the counter like it was evidence in a case he was certain he'd win. Her face hadn't changed either. Not in a pride, Not in a vindication, nothing that looked like a woman enjoying a reversal she'd earned the right to enjoy. If anything, she looked like she wished the terminal had stayed dark. Falk closed the folder gently, the way a man closes something he understands now to be heavier than its weight suggested. Then he did something Tanner had genuinely never seen him do, not once in 6 intake cycles. Not for a returning veteran, not for a general's son, not for anyone. He came to attention, and he saluted her. It wasn't theater. It wasn't for the line of soldiers watching, though they were watching, every one of them, hands sliding instinctively toward their sides. It was the salute of one operator acknowledging another, private and total, the kind that doesn't ask anything of the person receiving it except to be seen accurately, finally, after a morning of being seen wrong. Halvorsen returned it. Her hand was perfectly steady. Tanner noticed that the way he noticed everything when his pulse was doing something strange, the steadiness of her hand against the unsteadiness of everyone else's morning. Then, soldier by soldier, without a word of command from anyone, the 16 new arrivals in line came to attention. It started at the front, near her, and moved backward through the formation like something physical, a current finding the shortest path through standing water. By the time it reached the last man at the end of the hall, every one of them was standing the way you stand for something you've decided, on your own, deserves it. Brennan was the only one who hadn't moved. He stood with the folder's absence in his empty hands, his mouth open on a sentence he never finished, his face the color of the gray cardboard he'd been holding up for a joke 10 minutes earlier. He didn't salute. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, last, the only person in the room still catching up to what the room already understood. "Sergeant Brennan," Falk said, without turning his head, "you'll process the rest of the in-processing line. Staff Sergeant Halvorsen reports directly to my office." And Sergeant, the next time a file looks empty to you, you might consider that the Army doesn't pay people to leave nothing on the page. It pays them, sometimes, to leave everything off it. He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. He simply nodded once to Halvorsen, said, "Welcome to the cadre, Sergeant," in a voice that had gone almost gentle, and walked her toward the door at the end of the hall. Tanner stood at his counter for a long time after they'd gone. The secure terminal still glowing faintly with a page he was already required to forget the details of, and thought about the 11,000 files he'd processed and the thousands more he had left to go. He thought about how many of them, sitting in some drawer right now, might be carrying the exact same kind of silence. Not absence, not nothing, just a redaction bar standing patiently over a story too large for the room it had been filed in. He never told anyone exactly what the addendum had said. That wasn't his to tell. But for the rest of his career, whenever a new soldier's file came across his counter looking thinner than it should, Tanner made it a point to look twice before he let anyone in earshot decide what that thinness meant. Some files were empty because nothing had happened yet. Some were empty because everything had, and the page simply hadn't been given permission to say so. He thought, too, about Brennan, who finished out the in-processing line that morning in near silence, and never once, in the 18 months they went on working the same counter together, mocked another soldier's file again. Tanner never brought it up. He didn't need to. Some lessons only have to land once if they land hard enough. And that one had landed in front of 16 witnesses and a man holding a salute he hadn't planned to give. He kept that lesson away. He kept the salute he'd watched a lieutenant colonel give a staff sergeant on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Quietly, completely, and for good.